The stage lights came up, four men in impeccable suits, flashing warm smiles that melted the hearts of every American mother. They were the Statler Brothers, symbols of purity, brotherhood, and old-fashioned morality. But it was a great deception. Look backstage into the cold bathroom. There, Lew DeWitt, the angelic tenor, the soul of the group, was curled up on the tile floor. He wasn't singing. He was screaming silently. The vicious Crohn's disease was turning his intestines into a battlefield, as if 1,000 razor blades were ripping at his organs every second. For 20 years, while the audience laughed and laughed, Lew DeWitt had to smile and endure a public torture in the name of art. The success of the Statler Brothers was a machine powered by Lew's blood and bones, and when that machine reached its peak, it heartlessly dumped its exhausted fuel on the side of the road. It all began in 1955 in a town called Staunton, Virginia. Far from the flashy neon lights of Nashville, it's a quiet, conservative southern town nestled in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Time here moves slowly, and life revolves around church, factories, and family. In this dusty air, a boy named Lewis Calvin DeWitt Jr. grew up. Born in 1938, Lewis seemed like an ordinary country boy. But he possessed a gift, perhaps a curse, perhaps a gift from God, perfect pitch. He wasn't just a good singer, he saw sound. He could read notes from the honks of passing cars and find chords in the wind. His ear had the ability to deconstruct and reassemble all the sounds of the world into music. And his voice, Lew's, was a clear, transparent tenor. It soared above the harsh, turbid noise of the world, possessing both a sharpness and a gentleness that pierced the listener's soul. But for a poor boy in 1950s Virginia, music was a luxury. Lew had to work to survive. He was a taxi driver. Imagine, a musical genius who would later dominate the Billboard charts, behind the wheel of a worn-out cab, navigating the narrow streets of Staunton. During idle moments waiting for passengers, he'd strum his guitar and hum the complex melodies that came to his mind. That cramped, smelly cab was his first studio. Around that time, Lew began singing with other local young men, including brothers Don and Harold Reid and Phil Balsley. They sang gospel hymns in Methodist church basements and local school auditoriums. At the time, they were known as the Four-Star Quartet. At this point, we discover the group's unique power structure and the seeds of its tragedy. In the group's early days, the musical leader was undoubtedly Lew DeWitt. He knew how to read sheet music, arrange chords, and possessed unparalleled guitar skills. While the other members sang, Lew was the architect, designing how their voices should be layered together. On the other hand, the Reid brothers were different. Harold Reid, in particular, was a natural entertainer. He not only had a deep, rich bass voice, but also a knack for making people laugh. Don Reid was smart, ambitious, and a gifted writer. Phil Balsley was their quiet backing. Initially, this combination seemed perfect. Lew's musical genius and the Reid brothers' showmanship. It seemed like the perfect recipe for success. However, this balance was precarious. One side was responsible for art, while the other was responsible for show and business. Artists are sensitive and fragile, while businessmen are tough and ruthless. An invisible tug-of-war between these two forces, a Cold War, was already underway behind the small stage in Staunton. The story of how they came to be called the Statler Brothers symbolizes their tragic fate. They originally intended to perform under the name The Kingsmen, but a band with the same name already existed. A new name was needed. One day, sitting in their hotel room, they were contemplating a name when they noticed a box of Kleenex tissues on the table. The brand name on it was Statler Tissues. How about the Statler Brothers? They chose the name with a laugh. It was a name taken from a tissue box. It was the name of a disposable commodity. It was a cruel joke about the fate that would await Lew DeWitt. Furthermore, while the name included brothers, only Don and Harold were actually brothers. Lew and Phil were not. This was the first lie sold to the public, the image that we're all close like brothers. However, a perpetual rift existed between the Reid brothers, who were related by blood, and Lew DeWitt, who wasn't. Whenever the Reid brothers decided on the group's direction, they would consult among themselves at the dinner table or in their bedrooms. Lew was always a partner, not a family member. As the group grew more successful, the rift in this fake brotherhood began to widen. But in the early 1960s, they were still young and full of dreams. They toured local radio stations, and on weekends, they loaded up their old car with their instruments and traveled to small venues in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Their only weapon was their harmony. Their harmonies, rooted in gospel music, were unique. While typical country music typically features a lead vocal centered around a simple backing chorus, the Statler Brothers possessed a complex structure with 4 voices intertwined equally. And at the very top of that harmony, at the pinnacle of the pyramid, was always Lew DeWitt's tenor. His voice was as transparent as glass, chilling the listener's heart. That voice was a blessing from God, but the body that contained that blessing was slowly being consumed by a curse. Lew DeWitt first felt something wrong with his body in his late teens or early 20s. At first he thought it was just a simple stomach ache. He consoled himself by telling himself it was from stress or eating bad food. But the pain persisted. It came without warning. A cramp that felt like it was squeezing deep in his abdomen. A sharp pain, like an awl piercing his organs. Eating made the pain worse, so he instinctively avoided eating. The supposedly healthy young man's body became increasingly thin. He went to the bathroom more frequently than usual, and there he saw red blood. At the time, doctors shook their heads. It's nervous gastritis, reduced stress. It's just a sensitive intestine. Misdiagnoses followed. No one knew exactly what this illness was. Crohn's disease. This chronic inflammation of the digestive tract from mouth to anus was incurable even with modern medicine. It was even more uncharted territory for rural doctors in the late 1950s. Lew was isolated. He couldn't find the words to describe his pain. My stomach hurts couldn't describe the hell he was going through. Furthermore, he was a musician just beginning to pursue his dream. Sick meant weak, and in show business, weakness meant being eliminated. He decided to hide his illness. He stood on stage swallowing painkillers. When his stomach ached so much that he couldn't straighten his back, he tightened his guitar straps and forced himself to support himself. Even when cold sweat flowed down his eyes and he couldn't see, he smiled at the audience. That smile was a practiced one. He sublimated his pain into his voice. The reason his tenor sounded so poignant and sharp might be because it wasn't just a song, but a cry of the soul piercing through physical pain. He didn't know that this little secret he'd been trying to hide would eventually become a massive time bomb that would lead him to ruin. And the clock on that bomb began ticking rapidly in 1964, when they had a fateful encounter. In 1964, the Statler Brothers were still an unknown group. They enjoyed regional popularity, but they lacked something to become national stars. They were too genteel, too religious, too old-fashioned. Nashville record producers dismissed them. Gospel group, who listens to that these days? They were dismissed as outdated. But fate had a strange way of dealing with them. It was the day of a show in Canton, Ohio. They had the opportunity to open for Johnny Cash. the country music rebel and living legend of the time. Johnny Cash was the polar opposite of the Statler Brothers. He did drugs, was in and out of jail, and even broke lights on stage. He was dangerous, dark, and unpredictable, but Johnny Cash had a keener ear than most. When the Statler Brothers performed This Old House on stage, Johnny Cash paused backstage. He listened to their perfect harmony and was particularly captivated by Lew DeWitt's tenor voice floating above the harmonies. After the show, Cash came to see them. "You guys, do you want to come with me?" That one word changed everything. Johnny Cash hired them as his touring band. This was both the greatest fortune they'd ever had and the beginning of their worst tragedy. Johnny Cash's tour was a race from hell. Nearly 300 days a year of scheduling, naps on rattling buses, irregular meals, and endless drinking and partying. Thrown into that brutal schedule, which even healthy people struggled to endure, was Lew DeWitt, who suffers from chronic inflammatory bowel disease. It was like pouring oil on the fire. Bus life was torture for Lew. Tour buses in the 1960s lacked proper restrooms. Imagine the horror of enduring frequent bouts of acute stomach pain and diarrhea, forced to endure hours of waiting for the next gas station. While the other members laughed and chatted in the back seat, playing cards, Lew stared out the window, sweating profusely. He became increasingly quiet. He couldn't fit in at parties, and he couldn't drink alcohol. From this point on, a subtle tension began to develop within the group. To the Reid brothers, Lew began to be seen as a boring guy, a guy who always pretended to be sick and a mood breaker. They didn't understand, or perhaps didn't want to understand, the severity of Lew's suffering. Success was paramount to them, and to achieve that, they had to keep going. Ironically, it was during this period of intense physical suffering that Lew DeWitt produced the masterpiece that proved his genius. It was the song that would later immortalize the Statler Brothers. But a closer look at the lyrics reveals that it wasn't a love song or a song of joy. It was a monologue from a man driven mad by his isolation in a room. One day, while on tour with Johnny Cash, Lew DeWitt was sitting alone in a rundown motel room in Kansas. The other members were out drinking, but Lew couldn't leave. He was too sick. He lay in bed staring at the stains on the ceiling, and to relieve his boredom, he picked up his guitar. He looked around the room. The tacky floral wallpaper caught his eye. He fiddled with the deck of cards, one card short. The TV was playing Captain Kangaroo. He poured his heart into the lyrics, the story of a man isolated from the world, trapped in his room, killing time. Counting flowers on the wall, that don't bother me at all. Playing solitaire till dawn with a deck of 51, smoking cigarettes and watching Captain Kangaroo. Now don't tell me I've nothing to do. The melody was upbeat. The signature oom-pa rhythm was exciting. But the content was one of profound loneliness. It was a self-portrait of Lew DeWitt himself, imprisoned by Crohn's disease. Lew played this song for the members. At first, they tilted their heads because the lyrics were so strange. But when Johnny Cash heard it, he said, "This is the real deal." In 1965, Flowers on the Wall was released. The response was explosive. The song reached number 2 on Billboard's country charts and soared to number 4 on the pop charts. It even won a Grammy Award. The young men from Staunton became national superstars overnight. This song brought fame and fortune to the Statler Brothers. They were no longer Johnny Cash's opening band. They were stars in their own right. But the song's success also put Lew DeWitt in golden handcuffs. Now there was no stopping. The public wanted more hits and more shows. The tour schedule doubled. Lew was trapped in a prison of his own making. The more successful he became, the faster his body deteriorated. Now 4 men stand on stage laughing and singing "Flowers on the Wall." The audience cheers. But behind the laughter Lew DeWitt, like his own lyrics, is becoming utterly isolated. He struggles alone, caught between a disease that gnaws at his insides and the increasingly cold gaze of his colleagues. This was only the beginning of a decade-long war of silence. And as Lew DeWitt burned his body to propel the group to the top, a new component was already being prepared in the shadows to replace him. When the spotlight went out, so did the illusion of brotherhood. On stage, the Statler brothers were a perfect organism, but offstage they were already divided into two worlds. On one side was the world of business, racing toward success. On the other, the world of suffering, struggling for survival. And the rift between these two worlds was widening because of the very success that had bound them together. In 1968, the Statler Brothers' popularity was skyrocketing. After the success of Flowers on the Wall, they stopped riding in old vans. They rode in a massive custom tour bus. The bus was a symbol of success, plush couches, card tables, and endless roads. For Don and Harold Reid, the bus was a mobile office and a party venue. It was where they discussed concepts for their next album, negotiated guarantees, and celebrated their victories with beers after shows. But to Lew DeWitt, the bus was an ornate torture chamber. For people with Crohn's disease, unpredictability is the greatest fear. You never know when abdominal pain will strike or when you'll need to use the bathroom. The portable toilet on the bus was woefully inadequate for Lew's condition. Every time the bus drove on the highway, Lew's intestines would churn. While Don and Harold laughed and chatted in the front seat, Lew was curled up in a bunk in a dark corner at the back of the bus. He had the curtains tightly closed. That thin piece of cloth was the only barrier separating him from the rest of the group. "Lew, why don't you come out for a drink?" Initially, the members even offered to have a drink, but Lew had no choice but to decline. Alcohol was like poison to his inflamed intestines. "No, I'm just a little tired. I'll go to bed first." As this conversation repeated itself hundreds of times, an invisible wall began to form between the members. In the eyes of the Reid brothers, Lew increasingly appeared as a difficult guy and a socially awkward person. They either didn't know the true extent of Lew's physical suffering or didn't want to understand it. From a business person's perspective, Lew's illness wasn't something to be pitied, but rather a risk. To endure the pain and continue performing, Lew had to rely on medication. Doctors prescribed a powerful corticosteroid. While this drug was effective in suppressing inflammation, it came with terrible side effects. Lew's face began to change. His once sharp and handsome jawline vanished, and he developed a round, puffy face, a side effect of the medication known as moon face. His bones weakened, and his mood swings intensified. Some days he felt as energetic as a manic patient, but when the medication wore off, he fell into a deep depression. On stage, the Statler brothers performed comedy. Harold Reid cracked a joke, and the audience burst into laughter. Lew had to join in the laughter. But if you look closely at the footage from that period, Lew's smile is strangely unsettling. His mouth is smiling, but his eyes are empty. With a puffy face and a cold sweat, he mechanically played guitar chords. He was a ghost on stage. People watched him, but they didn't see the pain he felt. The audience cheered his high tenor voice, but they didn't realize that every time he strained his abs to produce that sound, he suffered a gut-wrenching agony. What was most brutal was the way the group's leaders, the Reid brothers, managed the situation. They didn't tell Lew to rest. They asked, "Are you available to perform tonight?" Behind that question lay the unspoken pressure. If you leave, you'll have to pay a penalty. And if you leave, the harmony won't be complete. Lew was a man with a strong sense of responsibility. He didn't want to ruin the team. So he took more pills, put on more makeup, and went on stage. He was sacrificing his own life to buy the team's success. In 1970, the Statler Brothers moved to Mercury Records and enjoyed a second heyday. They churned out hits like Bed of Roses and Do You Know You Are My Sunshine. The Nashville system embraced them completely. No longer outsiders, they were at the heart of Nashville's country music scene. But this success meant even greater isolation for Lew. The Statler Brothers were no longer just a band, but a company, with dozens of staff, managers, and publicists at their disposal. Don and Harold Reid were the company's capable CEOs. They led business meetings, selected songs, and planned tour schedules. Their decisions were ruthless. To maximize profits, we need to perform 250 nights a year. During this decision-making process, Lew's health wasn't considered. More accurately, it was treated as an obstacle to overcome. Lew was gradually excluded from the decision-making group. Lew is sick and sleeping right now. Let's decide among ourselves. This type of exclusion alienated Lew from the group. Although he was a founding member, he began to feel more and more like a singer for hire. He was singing over chords he'd created, but he felt like those chords no longer belonged to him. He was becoming a consumable item, a very expensive, high-performance, but frequently broken component. By the late 1970s, Lew's condition had deteriorated. There were increasingly days when medication failed to alleviate the pain. He was repeatedly rushed to the emergency room just before a performance, only to be given a painkiller injection and then return to the stage. By this time, the Reid brothers' patience was starting to wear thin. This wasn't a malice, but rather a very pragmatic business decision. We can't go on like this feeling uneasy. We can't sign a big contract without knowing when Lew might collapse. They began to consider alternatives. They didn't say it out loud, but their eyes were conversing. What if Lew disappears? Lew felt it too. They sang on stage arm in arm like brothers, but when the song ended and the lights went down, the members turned away coldly, and he sensed his own expiration date was nearing. He was afraid. Music was his life. The Statler Brothers was the home he had built, but those who held the keys to that home now treated him like an intruder. And then, in the winter of 1981, the fateful day finally arrived. Lew's body and the company known as Statler Brothers reached a breaking point where they could no longer coexist. The end did not come with a bang. It did not come with a dramatic backstage fight or a drug-fueled explosion. It came with the quiet, terrifying surrender of a human body that had simply run out of fuel. By the late autumn of 1981, Lew DeWitt was a walking corpse. The years of untreated Crohn's disease, masked only by the brutal efficacy of high-dose steroids, had finally collected their debt. The man standing on stage was no longer the architectural genius who had built the Statler Brothers sound. He was a shell. His skin was paper-thin, his bones were brittle, and inside his digestive tract was so ravaged by inflammation and scarring that it had essentially ceased to function. Every note he sang was a defiance of biology, but biology always wins in the end. The Statler Brothers, the corporate entity, the machine piloted by Don and Harold Reid, was facing a crisis. They had bookings, they had television appearances, they had a payroll to meet, but their star tenor, the voice that floated on top of their signature sound, was physically disintegrating before their eyes. The tension in the group had shifted from annoyance to panic. It wasn't just that Lew was difficult or withdrawn anymore. It was that he was becoming a liability. If he collapsed on stage during a televised special, the brand would be tarnished. The brain of the group began to calculate the risk. The heart of the group was failing. In November 1981, the inevitable happened. Lew DeWitt collapsed. The pain was no longer manageable with pills. He was rushed to the hospital. The doctors took one look at his internal organs and delivered a verdict that was both a salvation and a death sentence: surgery. Immediate, extensive, and brutal surgery. They would have to remove a significant portion of his intestines. The recovery would not be measured in weeks, but in months. For a touring band at the peak of their popularity, months are an eternity. The machine could not stop for months. Lying in his hospital bed, connected to tubes, weak and drugged, Lew DeWitt made a decision that would seal his fate. It was an act of profound professional integrity, and arguably his greatest tragedy. He knew the group had commitments. He knew he couldn't fulfill them. He didn't want to be the reason the Statler Brothers failed. So he offered a solution. He told Don and Harold about a kid he knew. "There's a singer," Lew whispered, his voice raspy from the tubes. "His name is Jimmy Fortune. He knows our songs. He can hit the high notes. Call him." Lew thought he was hiring a substitute teacher. He thought he was bringing in a temporary fix, a spare tire, to keep the car running until the main wheel could be repaired. He believed, with the naivety of a founder, that his seat would always be waiting for him. After all, he was the Statler Brothers. He wrote Flowers on the Wall. He created the harmony. How could they exist without him? He didn't realize he was handing the keys to the kingdom to the very man who would lock him out of it forever. Jimmy Fortune was everything Lew DeWitt was not in 1981. He was young, only 26 years old. He was healthy. He was starving for success. He had a full head of hair, a bright smile, and an energy that was infectious. And he had a voice, a tenor voice that was eerily similar to Lew's, but with a modern country pop sheen that fit perfectly with the changing sound of the 1980s. When Jimmy Fortune stepped onto the stage for his first temporary gig with the Statler Brothers, the chemistry shifted instantly. Imagine the perspective of Don and Harold Reid. For years, they had been dragging a sick, moody, medicated man across the country. Every show was a gamble. Every bus ride was a silent vigil. The energy was heavy, dark, and anxious. Suddenly, here was Jimmy. He bounded onto the bus. He laughed. He could eat pizza after the show. He could stay up late. He was grateful to be there. The dark cloud that had hovered over the group for a decade evaporated overnight. The Reids breathed a sigh of relief. The business was fun again. And the audience? The audience loved him. They didn't revolt. They didn't demand refunds because Lew wasn't there. They cheered for the handsome young kid with the high voice. This was the first dagger in Lew's heart, though he was too sick to feel it yet. The fans didn't miss him as much as he thought they would. If Jimmy Fortune had just been a good singer, Lew might have had a chance to return. But Jimmy Fortune dropped a nuclear bomb on Lew's hopes. While Lew was lying in the hospital, recovering from the agony of having feet of his intestines removed, enduring the humiliation of colostomy bags, and the slow, painful process of learning to eat again, Jimmy Fortune was on the bus writing songs. Jimmy wasn't just a singer, he was a songwriter. And he wrote a song called Elizabeth. It was a ballad. It was simple, romantic, and devastatingly catchy. It was exactly the kind of polished, sentimental country pop that the 1980s market was craving. The Statler Brothers recorded it with Jimmy on lead vocals. Elizabeth didn't just chart. It went to #1. It became a smash hit. It revitalized the group's career, opening them up to a whole new generation of fans who didn't care about Flowers on the Wall. Then Jimmy wrote My Only Love, another massive hit. Then Too Much on My Heart. In the span of 6 months, the substitute had become the MVP. He had done something Lew hadn't done in years. He had given the group a future. This brings us to the most brutal moment of the Statler Brothers' history. It was the moment the group's pragmatic leadership had to make a final decision about their ailing founder. It is early 1982. Lew DeWitt is finally healing. The surgery was a success. He is gaining a little weight. The color is returning to his cheeks. He is sitting in his home in Waynesboro listening to the radio. He hears Elizabeth. He hears the DJ announce that was the new #1 from the Statler Brothers. He feels a mix of pride and terror. He calls the brothers. "I'm getting better," he says. "I think I'll be ready to come back soon." The silence on the other end of the line must have been deafening. Don and Harold Reid weren't villains. They weren't movie villains, sitting around twirling their beards and plotting to harm others. They were, in fact, businessmen running a multi-million-dollar corporation, and they did what any businessman would do. Look at the ledger. What did they see when they looked at Lew? Unforeseen health risks, horrible mood swings, and terrible medication side effects. A sound stuck in the 60s, stress, anxiety, and the constant fear that the show could be canceled at any moment. When they looked at Jimmy, the picture was completely different. Back-to-back #1 hits. The explosive energy of youth. No health risks. A fun, stress-free touring environment. And most importantly, the bank account is growing by the day. It's a cold, logical calculation that's almost inhuman. But they ask themselves, why should we go back? Why should they trade in a new Ferrari for an old car that dies every 50 miles just for the sake of nostalgia? They didn't fire Lew immediately. That would be bad PR. Instead, they let the reality settle in. They let the success of Jimmy Fortune do the talking. They created an environment where Lew's return became logically impossible. In June 1982, the official announcement was made. It was crafted with the precision of a legal document. Due to ongoing health problems, Lew DeWitt is retiring from the Statler Brothers. We wish him the best. Jimmy Fortune is now a permanent member, retiring. The word tasted like ash in Lew's mouth. He wasn't retiring. He was 44 years old. He had just survived a major surgery specifically so he could sing again. He didn't want to retire. He was erased. The group he named, the harmony he built, the legacy he started, it was all gone. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a medical leave. The public accepted the narrative. "Oh, poor Lew, he's sick. It's good he's resting." They didn't see the man at home screaming at the walls. They didn't see the betrayal. They just turned up the volume on Elizabeth and hummed along. Lew DeWitt was now a man without a country. He was the architect standing outside the cathedral he built, watching another man preach from his pulpit. And the cruelest part? The cathedral was bigger, brighter, and louder than it had ever been when he was inside. The rest of 1982 was a blur of depression for Lew. The physical pain of Crohn's disease had abated slightly after the surgery, but it was replaced by a phantom pain, the pain of a missing limb. The Statler Brothers were his identity. Without them, who was he? Just a sick man in Virginia with a guitar. He watched the TNN television show, The Statler Brothers Show. It was a ratings juggernaut. It was the most popular show on the network. He watched Don and Harold cracking jokes, the same jokes they used to crack with him. He watched Phil standing silently in the background, and he watched Jimmy Fortune smiling that blindingly white smile, hitting the high notes that used to belong to Lew. It was a televised betrayal. Every Saturday night, Lew had to watch his own family replace him in front of millions. America wasn't just cheering for a new singer. They were cheering for his erasure. Lew tried to be gracious. He gave interviews saying he was happy for them. He played the part of the supportive brother. But inside, the resentment was cancerous. It wasn't just jealousy, it was an existential crisis. He had been discarded because he was broken. The message from his brothers was clear. We loved you, Lew, but we love winning more. This was the end of the brotherhood, and it was the beginning of Lew DeWitt's final solitary walk into the darkness. He would try to rise again. He would try to prove that he was more than just a broken part of a machine, but he was fighting against a tide that had already turned. The world had moved on, and his body, the traitor that had started this whole tragedy, was simply waiting for the right moment to strike again. By 1983, a terrifying phenomenon began to take hold, one that is unique to the brutal world of show business. It is called erasure. For Lew DeWitt, the founder of the group, the man who had given the Statler Brothers their name, their sound, and their biggest initial hit, the experience was not just one of being unemployed, it was one of being systematically wiped from history. The Statler Brothers machine, piloted by the shrewd and unsentimental brain of the group, Don and Harold Reid, did not just move forward, it accelerated. With the youthful, healthy, and hit-making Jimmy Fortune now firmly installed as the new tenor, the group entered their imperial phase. They were everywhere. They were on the radio with Elizabeth. They were on the cover of magazines. And, most devastatingly, they were on television. The Nashville network launched the Statler Brothers show. It was a Saturday night variety show, a throwback to the days of Dean Martin or Ed Sullivan. It was wholesome, it was funny, and it was wildly popular. For millions of Americans, Saturday night meant sitting down with the Statler Brothers. But for the millions of new fans tuning in, there was no history. They saw four men, Don, Harold, Phil, and Jimmy. They assumed this was the group. They assumed this had always been the group. Lew DeWitt was sitting in his living room in Waynesboro, Virginia, watching his own life being lived by a stranger. He saw Jimmy Fortune wearing the costumes that were designed for the tenor. He heard Jimmy Fortune singing the harmonies that Lew had composed. He saw Don and Harold laughing at Jimmy's jokes with the same camaraderie they had once shared with him. The group's leaders made practical decisions, while Lew remained the emotional core they quietly left behind. To the world, the Statler Brothers were healthier than ever. To Lew, it was proof that he had never really mattered at all. A lesser man might have withered away in silence. A man who accepted his role as a medical liability might have taken his royalty checks, which were still substantial from the back catalog, and lived a quiet life of retirement. But Lew DeWitt was not a retiree. He was an artist. He was the heart, and the heart, even when wounded, refuses to stop beating. In 1984 and 1985, Lew launched a desperate, defiant counterattack. He decided to launch a solo career. It was a move born of pride, of pain, and of a desperate need to prove that he was not dead yet. He entered the studio to record his debut solo album titled On My Own. The title itself was a double-edged sword. To the public, it sounded like a declaration of independence. To those who knew the truth, it sounded like a cry of abandonment. I am on my own because they left me. The music on My Own was different from the Statler Brothers' polished pop country. It was raw. It was stripped back. It showcased Lew's guitar playing, which was virtuosic, and his voice, which, though aged by illness, still held that crystalline, piercing clarity. He released a single, a cover of the old standard, You'll Never Know. Listen to his recording of that song today. It is not a love song to a woman. It is a funeral dirge for his brotherhood. When he sings, You'll never know just how much I miss you. You'll never know just how much I care. He is singing to Don, Harold, and Phil. He is singing to the empty space on the stage beside him. He poured his soul into that record. He believed, with the tragic optimism of the artist, that the quality of the work would save him. He believed that the fans would hear his voice and remember. He believed that the heart could defeat the brain. He was wrong. The release of On My Own revealed the cold, hard mechanics of the music industry. The Statler Brothers had the infrastructure. They had the major label support. They had the booking agents. They had the PR firms. They had the TV show. They were a corporation. Lew DeWitt had a guitar and a name that people vaguely recognized but couldn't quite place. When Lew sent his record to radio stations, the same stations that were blasting the Statler Brothers' My Only Love, he was met with polite indifference. The DJs didn't play it. The programmers didn't add it to rotation. Why? It wasn't because the music was bad. Critics who bothered to review it called it haunting, beautiful, and authentic. It failed because Lew DeWitt was bad business. He was the sick guy. He was the former member. In the glossy, upbeat world of 1980s country music, nobody wanted to hear the sad songs of a dying man. They wanted the happy, harmonious illusion of the Statler Brothers. The industry chose the machine over the man. Lew booked a tour to support the album, but it wasn't the arena tour he was used to. He wasn't playing Madison Square Garden anymore. He was playing county fairs in the afternoon. He was playing high school auditoriums. He was playing church basements. Imagine the humiliation. 2 years prior, he had been arriving in a custom tour bus greeted by screaming thousands. Now, he was driving his own car to a fairground, carrying his own guitar case, setting up his own microphone, and singing to a crowd of a few hundred people who were mostly eating corn dogs and waiting for the demolition derby. And even there, the ghost haunted him. In the middle of his set, someone in the crowd would inevitably shout, "Sing Flowers on the Wall." They didn't want Lew DeWitt, the solo artist. They wanted a piece of the Statler Brothers. They wanted him to perform the song that made the group famous, the group that had exiled him. Every time he sang it, it must have felt like reopening the surgical scars on his stomach. The tragedy of Crohn's disease is that it is inextricably linked to stress. The gut is the second brain. When the mind is in anguish, the body revolts. Lew had left the group to heal. He had undergone surgery to fix his body. And for a brief window in 1982 and 1983, it had worked. He had felt stronger. But the failure of his solo career, the humiliation of his erasure, and the constant gnawing bitterness of watching his former brothers soar to new heights without him, it created a toxic cocktail of stress that no surgery could fix. By 1986, Crohn's disease kept worsening, attacking his body in ways he could no longer ignore. He began to cancel his small solo shows. The unreliable label that had forced him out of the Statlers was now destroying his last attempt at independence. He was trapped in a vicious cycle. He needed to perform to prove he was alive, but performing was killing him. He retreated back to his home in Waynesboro. The guitar sat in its case more often. The shades were drawn. During this slow decline, what was happening between Lew and the Statler Brothers? This is the most chilling part of the story. There was no public feud. There were no lawsuits. Lew didn't go to the tabloids to trash Don and Harold. Don and Harold didn't badmouth Lew in interviews. Communication dwindled to a polite distance, the kind shared between people who used to be close but no longer knew how to reconnect. "Oh, Lew is doing his own thing. We wish him the best. He's a great talent." It was the politeness of strangers. They spoke of him as if he were a distant cousin they hadn't seen in years, not the man they had shared a microphone, a bus, and a life with for 2 decades. Privately, the distance was absolute. They were living in the same small town of Waynesboro, Staunton. They likely shopped at the same grocery stores. They drove down the same streets, but their worlds never touched. The Reid brothers were busy building an empire. They were opening the Statler Brothers complex, a massive office and museum in Staunton. They were becoming the town's royalty. Lew was fading into the town's background, a living specter of its musical history. Locals would see him occasionally, looking frail, walking with a cane, his face swollen from medication or gaunt from malnourishment. They would whisper, "That's Lew DeWitt. He used to be one of them." The contrast was a living, breathing injustice. The brain had won the town, the fame, and the future. The heart was left to beat alone in the dark, slowly failing, surrounded by the echoes of a harmony he had created but could no longer join. As the 1980s drew to a close, the town of Waynesboro, Virginia, became the stage for a silent Gothic horror story. It was a tale of divergent paths unfolding in the very same town, separated not by distance, but by a wall of indifference. While the Statler brothers basked in an endless summer of television ratings and merchandise sales just a few miles away, Lew DeWitt's world was fading into a permanent twilight. This was the world of Lew DeWitt. While the group was busy cementing their legacy with monuments, the man who started it all was slowly disintegrating. Lew was living in the same town, breathing the same air, but he might as well have been on the moon. Lew faded from their world, present in body but no longer acknowledged as part of the group. Locals would occasionally see him at the grocery store or the pharmacy, a frail figure moving slowly down the aisles. The locals, the people who had cheered for him when he was a local boy made good, now averted their eyes. It was awkward to look at him. He was a reminder of the ugly truth behind the town's most famous export. To acknowledge Lew was to acknowledge that the Statler brothers weren't perfect, and nobody wanted to pop that balloon. The medical tragedy of Lew DeWitt entered its final catastrophic phase in the late 1980s. Crohn's disease is a thief. It steals your nutrition, your energy, and your dignity. But the treatment is a loan shark. The high-dose steroids and immunosuppressants that Lew had taken for decades to stay on stage were now coming to collect their debt with interest. The steroids had ravaged his internal organs. His heart, the engine that had driven the band's rhythm for 20 years, was weakening. It was enlarging, struggling to pump blood through a body that was constantly inflamed. His kidneys were failing. The toxins that a healthy body filters out began to build up in his blood. This is a slow, confusing, and exhausting way to die. It brings a fog to the mind and a heaviness to the limbs. Imagine the cruelty of this specific decline. Lew DeWitt was a man defined by his voice, a clear bell-like tenor. But kidney failure and heart disease steal your breath. They fill your lungs with fluid. For a singer, this is the ultimate suffocation. He still had the music in his head, he still had the pitch in his ear, but he no longer had the breath to push it out into the world. He spent his days in and out of the hospital, the same hospital where he had recommended Jimmy Fortune in 1981. Now, in 1988, he lay in those beds alone. There were no band meetings around his bedside anymore. There were no producers waiting for him to recover. There was just the beep of the monitor and the silence of a phone that rarely rang. As his health declined, Lew began the painful process of dismantling his life. It is said that in his final years, he began to let go of the physical reminders of his time with the Statlers. He looked at the gold records on his wall. Flowers on the wall, class of '57. I'll go to my grave loving you. These objects, once symbols of his triumph, were now artifacts of his trauma. They were proof that he had built a mansion that he was forbidden to enter. He watched the TNN show. He saw Jimmy Fortune singing More Than a Name on a Wall, a massive hit for the group in 1989. The irony was suffocating. The song was about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, about remembering the forgotten. But as Lew watched, he realized he was becoming just a name on a wall, a footnote in the liner notes of a greatest hits album, a trivia answer for die-hard fans. Jimmy Fortune was not a villain. He was a talented man doing a job. But to Lew, Jimmy was a living mirror reflecting everything Lew had lost. Jimmy had the health, the youth, the voice, and the brothers. Lew had the pain. The question that haunts this period is, where were they? Where were Don and Harold Reid? Where was Phil Balsley? They were not evil. They likely sent cards. They likely made polite phone calls checking in, But they did not stop the machine. They did not pause the tour. They did not dedicate shows to him. This is the cold brutality of the show must go on mentality. To the Reid brothers, Lew was a closed chapter. They had grieved the loss of their partner back in 1982. They had done the calculations, made the hard choice, and moved forward. To revisit Lew now, to drag the public's attention back to the dying man in Waynesboro, would be off-brand. It would bring down the mood. It would remind the audience of sickness and death, and the Statler brothers were in the business of happiness and nostalgia, so they kept their distance. They protected the brand by quarantining the tragedy. This silence was louder than any scream. It confirmed to Lew that his exile was permanent. He wasn't just a former member. He was a liability to the good vibes of the Statler brothers' enterprise. In 1989, Lew's condition became critical. The doctors told him there were no more surgeries to do. The damage to his heart and kidneys was irreversible. It was a matter of time. Lew DeWitt, the musician, faced this with a quiet dignity. He didn't lash out. He didn't write a tell-all book exposing the coldness of the Reids. He didn't sue for more money. Instead, he turned inward. He spent his final months in a state of reflection. He reconnected with his faith, the original gospel faith that had started it all in the basements of Staunton. But there is a profound sadness in the image of the dying architect, a man who hears music in everything, in the wind, in the rain, in the hum of the dialysis machine, but has no one to share it with. The harmony was broken. He was a solo act now, playing to an audience of none. He was 51 years old. He looked 80. The moon face from the steroids had given way to a gaunt, skeletal wasting. The spark in his eyes, that mischievous glint that you can see in the early photos of the group, was dimming. As the year 1990 dawned, the brain of the Statler brothers was planning their biggest tour yet. They were celebrating their 25th anniversary of Flowers on the Wall. They were celebrating the song Lew wrote. And Lew was preparing to die. The summer of 1990 in the Shenandoah Valley was hot, humid, and heavy with silence. While the cicadas buzzed in the trees of Waynesboro, the life of Lew DeWitt was flickering out like a candle in a drafty room. There is a terrible loneliness to dying young. Lew was only 52 years old. This is an age when a man should be enjoying the fruits of his labor, watching his children grow, perhaps planning a comeback tour. Instead, Lew was confined to a bed, his body a battlefield where the war was already lost. His heart, ravaged by the long-term effects of steroid treatments and the strain of chronic illness, was failing. His kidneys, overwhelmed by toxins, had shut down. The architect of harmony could no longer keep the rhythm of his own life. Behind the polished image of their hometown, a silent divide had split their lives apart. While the Statler brothers were preparing for another season of their hit TV show, they were reviewing scripts, approving merchandise, and rehearsing harmonies. The machine was humming along, efficient and profitable. On the other side of town, the heart was stopping. There were no cameras at Lew's bedside. There were no fans waiting outside for an autograph. There was only the quiet, clinical reality of terminal illness. It is not recorded if Don or Harold Reid visited him in those final desperate hours. If they did, it was a private goodbye. There were no public vigils from his former bandmates, just a quiet, private end to a partnership that had once captivated America. The group that Lew had built was too busy being famous to stop and hold the hand of the man who had started it all. On August 15, 1990, the struggle ended. Lew DeWitt passed away in his home. There was no dramatic final speech. There was no last perfect high note sung into the air. There was just a final breath, and then stillness. The man who had written Flowers on the Wall, the man whose voice had defined a generation of gospel and country music, was gone. The news did not break with the force of a tsunami. It rippled out slowly. In 1990, there was no social media, no instant internet tributes. It was a wire story, a short paragraph in the newspapers. Lew DeWitt, founding member of the Statler Brothers, dead at 52. To the general public, it was a moment of mild sadness. Oh, the guy who left, that's a shame. They turned the page to the sports section. But for those who knew the truth, for those who understood the anatomy of the Statler Brothers, it was a moment of profound, chilling finality. The exile was now permanent. There would be no reunion. There would be no reconciliation concert. The wound would never be healed. It would simply be buried. The group had grown into an industry, and Lew no longer fit inside its demanding structure. They were now a brand that could not pause for grief. They issued a statement. It was polite. It was respectful. It used all the right words. They expressed their sadness at the loss of their former partner. They acknowledged his talent. But actions speak louder than press releases. They did not cancel their tour. They did not suspend their TV show season. They did not announce a year of mourning. Why? Because the Statler Brothers were in the business of nostalgia, and death is the enemy of nostalgia. Death is real. Death is ugly. Death reminds the audience that the good old days are gone and everyone is getting older. To dwell on Lew's death would be to damage the brand. So, the brain of the group made the executive decision: acknowledge, grieve briefly, and move on. The show must go on. The tickets were already sold, the advertisers had paid, and the business was simply too big to pause for the death of its architect. The funeral was held in Waynesboro. It was a solemn affair. Friends, family, and industry figures gathered to pay their respects. Don, Harold, and Phil attended. Of course they did. They were not monsters. They were men who had shared a life with Lew. Standing by the graveside, looking at the casket, they surely felt the weight of the years. They surely remembered the days in the station wagon, the 1960s, the thrill of the first hit record. But there was an unbridgeable distance between the mourners. The Statler Brothers stood there as the kings of country. They were wealthy, healthy, and beloved. They were the survivors. Lew lay in the box as the casualty. He was the price paid for the journey. As they lowered him into the ground, they were burying more than just a man. They were burying the uncomfortable truth of their own history. With Lew gone, the narrative belonged entirely to them. There was no one left to say, "That's not how it happened." There was no one left to remind the world that the happy brotherhood was a myth born of pain. Lew DeWitt took the secrets of the dressing room, the agony of the bus rides, and the bitterness of his exile with him into the earth. The silence he left behind was exactly what the brand needed. The most heartbreaking moment of this tragedy did not happen at the graveside. It happened on stage a few nights later. The Statler Brothers returned to the spotlight. The lights went down. The crowd roared. Don Reid welcomed the audience with his signature warmth. They told jokes, they laughed, and then they played the song. Jimmy Fortune, the man who had replaced Lew, stepped up to the microphone. The band struck the opening chords of Flowers on the Wall. The signature pa-pa rhythm filled the arena. Counting flowers on the wall that don't bother me at all. Jimmy sang it beautifully. He hit the notes. The crowd cheered. They sang along. But think about the cruelty of that moment. Flowers on the Wall was Lew's song. It was his diary of isolation. It was his cry for help when he was trapped in a motel room, tortured by his own body. It was the most personal, painful thing he had ever created. And now, with Lew's body barely cold in the ground, The man who took his job was singing Lew's pain to a cheering crowd, collecting the applause and cashing the check. The Statler brothers didn't just replace Lew, they commodified his suffering. The very pain that had destroyed him was now being polished, packaged, and sold as entertainment by the men who had left him behind. This was the final victory of the brain over the heart. The heart had stopped beating, but the brain had figured out how to keep selling the heart's rhythm. As the 1990s progressed, the memory of Lew DeWitt began to fade from the public consciousness. The Statler brothers continued their reign. They won more awards. They released more albums. To the new generation of fans, Jimmy Fortune was the only tenor they knew. Lew was just a trivia fact, a name in a history book. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the applause, the ghost of Lew DeWitt lingered. The lie of the happy brotherhood was perfect, but it was haunted. The smile was still there, but the scream had been silenced forever. Now only the legacy remained. And as we will see in the final chapter, even legacies can be rewritten by the victors. After the earth settled over Lew DeWitt's grave in August 1990, the Statler brothers did not slow down. In fact, they accelerated into a decade of unprecedented stability and prosperity. The 1990s were a turbulent time for country music. The class of '89, Garth Brooks, Alan Jackson, Clint Black, had arrived, bringing with them a new, aggressive sound that swept away the old guard. Legends like George Jones and Johnny Cash were being dropped from radio playlists. The industry was purging the past to make way for the explosion of modern country. Yet miraculously, the Statler brothers survived the purge. Why? Because the brain of the group, Don and Harold Reid, had constructed a fortress that was immune to trends. They didn't need radio, they had television. Their show on TNN continued to be a ratings powerhouse throughout the decade. They had their own theater in Virginia. They had a direct pipeline to their audience, bypassing the gatekeepers of Nashville who had once scorned them. During this imperial phase, the history of the group began to calcify into a specific narrative. To the millions of fans watching on Saturday nights, the Statler brothers were Don, Harold, Phil, and Jimmy. The chemistry was perfect. The banter was effortless. Jimmy Fortune was no longer the new guy. He was the essential tenor. His songs, Elizabeth, My Only Love, More Than a Name on a Wall, were the pillars of their set list. Lew DeWitt was being rewritten. He wasn't erased completely, that would be impossible, but he was diminished. He became a footnote. In the official lore of the group, he was the starter tenor, the man who helped launch the ship but couldn't make the voyage across the ocean. The complexity of his departure, the agony of his illness, and the coldness of his exile were smoothed over into a palatable corporate soundbite. Lew retired due to health, and we were lucky to find Jimmy. It was a clean story. It was a safe story. And because the dead cannot speak, it became the only story. The ultimate contrast between the life of Lew DeWitt and the life of the Statler brothers can be found in how they ended. Lew's end was a forced ejection. He was pushed out of the moving car, left on the side of the road to wither away in silence. He didn't get a farewell concert. He didn't get a standing ovation. He got a press release and a hospital bill. In 2002, the Statler brothers decided to call it quits, but their end was a coronation. They announced a massive farewell tour. It was a victory lap across America. They played to sold-out arenas. They were feted by dignitaries. They released a live concert DVD titled The Farewell Concert. Imagine the scene at the final show in Salem, Virginia, on October 26th, 2002. The arena is packed, the lights are dazzling. Confetti rains down from the ceiling. Don, Harold, Phil, and Jimmy stand center stage, holding hands, bowing to the adoring multitude. They are retiring on their own terms. They are wealthy, healthy, and beloved. They are walking away into a golden sunset of their own making, somewhere in a cemetery in Waynesboro. The grass was growing over Lew DeWitt's headstone. The injustice of this contrast is staggering. The man who designed the car died in the ditch while the men who drove it crossed the finish line to fireworks. The farewell tour was a celebration of the brand, and the brand had successfully survived the death of its creator. 6 years after their retirement, the ultimate validation arrived. The Country Music Hall of Fame announced that the Statler Brothers would be inducted into the class of 2008. This is the holy grail of country music. It is immortality cast in bronze. The ceremony was held in Nashville. It was a black tie affair, attended by the titans of the industry. When the moment came, the Statler Brothers were called to the stage, and here history faced a dilemma. Who goes up? Don Reed went up, Harold Reed went up, Phil Balsley went up, and Jimmy Fortune went up. But Lew DeWitt was inducted too. The Hall of Fame recognizes the original members. So for the first time in nearly 30 years, Lew DeWitt was on stage with his brothers. But he wasn't there. His award was accepted posthumously. The moment was thick with unsaid things. Seeing Jimmy Fortune standing there, alive, smiling, holding his medallion, while Lew was represented only by a name on a plaque, was the final brutal visual representation of their saga. Jimmy Fortune deserved to be there. He had kept the band alive for 20 years. But Lew DeWitt was the band. He was the seed. In their acceptance speeches, they mentioned Lew. They spoke kind words. They acknowledged his contribution, but words are cheap in the face of decades of silence. The bronze plaque in the Hall of Fame lists all 5 names. They are frozen together in metal for eternity. Brothers once again. But the metal is cold, and the distance between the names is infinite. So what is the verdict of this autopsy? What killed the harmony? We started this story by looking at the smile of the Statler Brothers, that wide, reassuring, wholesome smile that sold millions of records. We end it by looking at the scream hidden behind it. The tragedy of the Statler Brothers is not that they were bad people. Don and Harold Reed were not villains in a melodrama. They were pragmatic men running a business in a cutthroat industry. They made the logical choices. When a part broke, they replaced it. When the engine faltered, they swapped it out. They protected the livelihood of their families and their employees. By the metrics of capitalism, they were heroes. They saved the company. But by the metrics of humanity, they committed a slow, silent sin. They allowed their brother, the man whose genius gave them their start, to suffer in isolation. They allowed the heart of their group to be excised so the brain could survive. They chose the perfection of the product over the messiness of the person. Lew DeWitt's life is a testament to the cruelty of the show must go on mentality. He gave his youth, his energy, and ultimately his health to the music. He poured his life force into the music until there was simply nothing left to give, and his reward was to be left behind. His story asks us a difficult question. What is the cost of your entertainment? When we listen to Flowers on the Wall today, we tap our feet. We smile. It's a catchy song. But now, you know the truth. You know that the man singing that high, clear tenor note was standing in a vocal booth, clutching his stomach, sweating through a fever, terrified that he was dying. You know that the song about counting flowers on a wall wasn't a joke. It was a cry for help from a man trapped in a prison of his own body. The Statler Brothers built a cathedral of sound. It was beautiful, it was profitable, it was legendary, but if you put your ear to the walls of that cathedral, you don't just hear the harmony. You hear the ghost of Lew DeWitt, the architect who was locked out of his own creation, singing a solo that no one wanted to hear. The lie was beautiful. The harmony was perfect. But the silence that followed was the only thing that was true.